Okay, what might put me in a position to suggest there is time for a rethink about estuarine conservation? I've got a reasonable amount of history with estuaries. My first visit to KwaZulu in Lake Sabaya was 1965. I started working in St. Lucia in the mid-70s, and since then I've been involved in one way or other in virtually every system except in Gubuseleni, from KwaZulu down to probably Scottsboro, so all the estuaries along the way, with recent visits to the Limpopo, which is quite an impressive system, and the Mzimvubu. So what is this rethink I'm talking about? And a subtitle, possibly a rather cynical one, is, do we really care? And judging by the state and condition of many of our systems, I actually sometimes wonder about that. Okay, to some degree this talk was also triggered by an article I read recently in New Scientist, headline Truth Decay. And what the people were doing there was to look at the fate of papers in terms of how long are they cited for, and how long does it take before the results and the conclusions get discredited, which is quite an interesting one. So papers have a sort of half-life. And that moves me on to the next point, which is this rather maybe complicated nature of sentence up there, the iconoclastic nature of science, that if as scientists we are not challenging existing paradigms, we are failing in our duty. So let's do a bit of challenging of what we think, and particularly look at these two questions here. What have we really learnt at this stage about estuarine ecology that is unlikely to be seriously challenged? So what can we be confident about? What have we actually done that is relevant or demonstrates a real understanding of estuarine ecology, particularly in this context as regards conservation? Like, what have we done? We've classified these systems into those categories you can see there: estuarine lakes, bays, river mouths, permanently open systems, and intermittently open. Bit of detail, examples: KwaZulu Bay, St. Lucia, big salinity variations, generally small tidal prism. Estuarine bays, in our context, Durban Bay, Richards Bay, but also Neisner. Big systems again, permanent links with the sea, large tidal prism, so strong marine influence. River mouths, Mkomazi, Mvoti, Umfolozi, not the only ones, probably Chigala. Riverine processes dominance of big catchments, strong influence of river flow, of fresh water. Mouth generally permanently open, but not always. Generally a small tidal prism, so this very strong freshwater influence. Permanently open, this again, these are ones that are mostly open, but can close every now and again. Umgeni, Umulazi. Salinity gradients driven by tidal action and the relevant river flow. So salinity gradients, horizontal gradients, vertical gradients. The intermittently open types, the major ones, the most common ones, Mshloti, Zazella, and Schlanga. Generally small, characterized by large sandbars, often across the mouths. Some tidal and riverine inputs depending on the conditions of the bar and whether the system is open or not. Okay, so what? To some degree, one can relate the different conditions that exist in those different systems to the fauna there. It generally works fairly well with the resident invertebrates, the benthos. It's not so good when it comes to birds and fish, but then they are both highly mobile, so they can be present very opportunistically. So beyond the classification, we've taken a bit further. We have ranked. So if you go and look in the literature, you can find a ranking of estuaries based on size, vegetation, habitat diversity, various other things. So we've got a ranking, which makes a fair bit of sense. No? So what? We also have more recently an assessment of estuarine ecological status, so the health of these systems. What are they like? What is their health condition like? This is summarized on a national basis, so you've got a ranking system there as well. And in those cases where we've had reserve determinations done, we can be a bit more confident rather than relying on Google Earth and aerial pictures and so on to draw conclusions about what the system actually looks like. There's been odd and anticipated implications of this, because if you then come to planners and developers and so on, you tend to be asked, okay, well, is this system important relative to that one? And you say, no, it's not as critical. And you're thinking, well, that's an obvious sort of answer. Then, okay, well, fine. Then we'll put the wastewater treatment works on that one and we'll trash it completely because it's not as important as the other one. So something that you think shouldn't necessarily have any implications at all suddenly does start having a few. You then come to the question of why do we actually do all this? This ranking, etc., etc. And in our context, presumably conservation, protection. Protection of what? Are we targeting anything in particular? Now, I've been avalanched, particularly by listening to those people who were at the legal session might agree with me, the plethora of laws and acts and policies and God knows what else, which are very difficult to interrelate to each other if you're a simple biologist, doesn't really give you all that much guidance. So I would like to think that we are presumably trying to protect estuarine function. Estuaries function as nursery grounds. You've heard plenty about the fish. Nursery grounds in contexts like St. Lucia and Richards Bay, nursery ground for prawns. They are stopping off points for migratory waders. They have aesthetic attractions. There's all sorts of functions. And the question then comes up is, how much of this national estuarine function are we actually prepared to lose? Because if you look at, this is where the problems start arising, how do you come to a decision there? And I have a problem here. I'll develop this argument in the next 2 or 3 minutes, because if you cut through all the strategies and so on, what they seem to come down to me is to be based on some idea of representativity. So we must protect a certain amount of representative estuarine function. We can make it fairly complicated by saying, look, we want to incorporate aesthetics and nursery functions and diversity of habitat and vegetation types and put through something like markstone maybe and mesh all this lot together and come up with an ideal and say, well, fine, that estuary there incorporates everything that's desirable. That one we must protect. Now then ask, what about the rest? So I'm not totally happy with this idea of representativity. I can see it to some degree being applicable in a terrestrial environment. Don't want to go too far down that line. And we know, for instance, from things like biogeographical theory, the bigger the area you have, the more species diversity you can expect, etc., etc. But if you're going to apply this idea of representativity at whatever level to an estuarine system, it implies you're going to accept a certain amount of national estuarine loss of function. Now, I'm not happy with that. That's my personal viewpoint, but I think maybe it's something we should actually be thinking about. Developing to some extent from there, and my question in relation to this lot, this idea of protecting estuarine environments, is do we really need to destroy estuary? Do we really need to damage these systems? And my feeling, which might be slightly naive, is that I don't see development as being totally incompatible with maintenance of estuarine function. I don't see why that should actually happen. Okay, do we have to fill in these systems? And this picture there gives you a great example. You put a causeway across 80% of it, you take out habitat, you reduce flow through there, with all sorts of knock-on effects from that in terms of the way sediments are distributed and so on. We treat them as conduits for wastewater, and this is a major problem, particularly in the small systems that close off, but it's more or less accepted. And my question would be, are all these really necessary? Dealing with that central bullet there, freshwater abstraction, okay, this is something that we would have to deal with because to a large degree we are a water-short country. So there's going to be freshwater abstraction. What we need to get a clear handle on there is just how much, to what degree can we modify freshwater flow into estuarine systems. The thorny questions in terms of the sort of management ideas that have come up. You would have heard about the reserve determination in relation to freshwater systems if you're at that particular section. There's also reserve determinations in relation to estuaries. Estuaries have a freshwater requirement. The details really matter here. But the question then is, has it had any effect anywhere? Now, I think Nicolette listed something like 11 estuarine reserve determinations which she had driven the other day, one of which had been signed off and none of them been implemented in any way whatsoever. So what do you do? Where, ironically, has anything happened? And that's quite intriguing because we find that within the eThekwini municipality, the Umhlanga system, which is the one you can see there, was actually receiving much more water than it normally received because of discharge from wastewater treatment works, which meant that the normal breaching pattern was totally disrupted, and there's been some quite serious arm twisting and persuasion at this stage. So we have an agreement from the eThekwini municipality that they will reroute a lot of that water that went in there back to the system it came from in the first place. There's also some input being provided in relation to wastewater treatment works on the Mshloti, but again, not through DWA, but through the eThekwini municipality. Has there been any rehabilitation? Now, I don't know of any system in our part of the world, probably any system in South Africa, where rehabilitation has actually been implemented. That picture there is taken of the Siaya River, just near Mtunzini in the early 60s, and that has had, there was a major operation in the early 80s driven by George Begg with input from Ori and God knows what else, all sorts of people, and it was repeated twice after that, and that is what it looks like now. That's the same place, okay, taken from just about the same spot. So I have my doubts then about, just how we put all this lot together. Okay, I'd like to finish off in the 2 or 3 minutes that are left to me to take, maybe wrap up the St. Lucia saga and look at this as an example and bring out a few points that struck me, which might have been brought up previously, but might not have been emphasized to the same extent. Okay, that 56% of the South African estuarine area might be slightly more, slightly less, but that's the sort of level you're talking about. What is important to me, though, is that second bullet. This was 90% of the South African protected estuarine area. And in the next bullet there, what do you think the reaction would have been if we'd lost 90% of our protected terrestrial habitat? I think there would have been quite a strong reaction. One of the Bibles that is referred to is the Creel Commission of Inquiry, which was produced in 64-66. My italics there in relation to the alleged threat to animal and plant life in St. Lucia lakes. Not a proven, demonstrated threat, an alleged threat. And if you read through that document, it is said that so-and-so, it is said that so-and-so, there's paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. Do you think, well, where did that come from? And there's a quote following that from C.W. Methven. Cathcart Methven, 1903, visited the system. Now, Cathcart Methven was a harbour engineer. He didn't go to St. Lucia to go fishing. He went up there to check out whether this place would serve as a harbour or not. So, in 1903, he came up with that statement that you can read there, as well as I can. Unproven, a statement. And what has been quite intriguing is that that statement seems to have been perpetuated. If we move on to the sedimentation story, this is a process that's been going on for the last 5,000 years. Those are documented, the data is there. The Creel Commission of Inquiry was extremely useful in some very useful data that it produced in terms of mud deposition, sediment deposition, various areas, where were the original channels, where were the original shallow areas, and so on. So we come to the next question then is, how do we get to this totally unprecedented situation where the lake dried up? I think the question I raised this morning. What happened? Severe drought is the standard argument that is put forth. What is a drought? Now, this is actually quite an interesting question. Because as South Africans, we intuitively think we know what a drought is. But look for a definition of a drought, you're not going to find it. There is no definition, a single definition that suits every situation. What is a drought? Does it simply mean slightly below average rainfall? At what point? Generally, the government might declare an area drought-stricken. But where's the threshold? And in the context of the St. Lucia situation, one can well argue that 60 years of isolation from the Umfolozi would constitute an anthropogenic drought, as far as that system is concerned. So, going back to Methven's idea, assessed of 5 minutes, still got 5 minutes. Oh, I can slow down a bit, okay. Coming back to Methven's analysis, and again, I won't go into that old story about God and an engineer, that we can save for later, but the price of that untested perception about the perils of sediment, which for a long time wasn't even distinguished. I mean, what exactly is sediment? Gravel? Sand? Mud? Fluvial sediment? Marine sediment? Where did it all come from? What was the actual problem there? This graph here has also been used, we might have seen it this morning, in terms of, I think Nikki used it as prepared by Derek Stretch and his co-authors, emphasizing, okay, the way in which annual rainfall deviates from an average. Now, one of the things that came out in that Krill Commission was in relation to, if you read through it, the unstated aspects that if things move away from stability, people don't like it. So there were statements quoting the UCT zoology people that if the salinity goes below about 15, that's not so good. If it goes beyond 35, that's not so good, because then your diversity of estuarine organisms starts declining. Okay, maybe, yes, but what happens if you have a Des Moines? What are you going to do about it? Pray? If the salinity goes, if you get a big rainfall event, the salinity will go down. That's the way it works. If it goes the other way, again, if this can be shown to be an anthropogenic effect, well, maybe there's something you can do about it. But what is also intriguing here was that, again, if you look at that graph, look at all the bars in the histogram, it's actually quite unusual to find anyone that doesn't deviate quite substantially from that average level. So you've got histograms above the line, or bars above the line, bars below the line. It's actually very seldom that you get an average. So the average is, yes, a statistical construct, but it's something that actually in practice very rarely happens. So the normal situation would be one where you have these fluctuations, not where you get an average condition. 2 minutes, okay. I thought you might like that quote down there. The French Bourbon kings were exiled in somewhere in the 1800s. They then came back to France, re-established themselves, and Talleyrand made that following comment. They'd learnt nothing and forgotten nothing. Let us hope that we can move beyond that. So, moral lessons. I think one of the points that should be emphasized comes back to a point that Miles Mander made. Measure and then decide. Measure and then decide. Have your data, have your details. If it's an idea, test it. If it gets thrown out, no problem. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Tiki. I've got one burning question floating around the room. No. She's biased. Oh.
I just wanted to bring the point back to your setting of targets or representativity or conserving estuaries in that way, given that we all know of the linkage that exists between these systems. And you focused on St. Lucia at the end. I think you were jumping on the bandwagon with all of us, but beside that, I think for me what stands out of that was the things you didn't say about the rest of the systems on the KZN coast. Because with St. Lucia being out of play, it was probably even more important to know that we had areas south of that were in a condition to step up to the mark and that things could be able to use as a nursery area. So I just wanted to make that comment because I think it needs to be brought into our thinking about these stepping stones along our coast.
Take your point, and just one little thing I'd like to add was that apart from the impact on the fish populations, which have been discussed in some detail, we also had the total collapse of the Natal inshore prawn fishery. Now, there was certainly a contribution coming in from the development of Richards Bay as a harbour, which obviously has destroyed that nursery ground. But we know from our tagging programs, which you ran in the 90s, that St. Lucia does definitely contribute to the prawns on the Jigella Bank. And that fishery, okay, one can quibble about the niceties of whether a prawn fishery is a good idea or not, but that fishery was also collapsed, and one can attribute it directly to the loss of St. Lucia as a nursery ground.
Okay, thanks very much, Tiki.